A single chime could command an entire city to work, pray, or obey. This was the power of the medieval tower bell, a weapon of control hidden in plain sound. You are about to discover how the silent battle over timekeeping reshaped society and forged the modern world. We will uncover why towns smashed the clocks of their lords and how the Black Death created a bizarre power vacuum by silencing the bells. By the end, you will see the relentless chime of your own smartphone notifications as the direct descendant of this ancient conflict. What part of your own daily schedule feels most controlled by an outside force? Before the first mechanical clocks ever ticked, a revolution in time was already ringing out from the quiet isolation of monasteries. The Benedictine monks of the 10th and 11th centuries lived by a sacred rule, one that demanded prayers at 7 specific hours throughout the day and night. This was not a suggestion, but a rigid, divinely ordered schedule. Their entire world, from sleep to labor to contemplation, was orchestrated by the sound of a bell. The call to matins in the deep darkness of night, the signal for lords at dawn, the chime for vespers as the sun set, these bells carved the endless flow of time into manageable, holy segments. This was celestial time, a rhythm intended to mirror the harmony of the heavens themselves. Yet this spiritual need for precision created a practical problem that would change the world. How could a community ensure it woke for prayers at the exact same hour every single night, especially under a blanket of cloud? How could it coordinate its labors in the scriptorium and fields with such unerring regularity? The sun and water clocks of the ancient world were too unreliable for this new, demanding form of life. The monastery's spiritual mission, it turned out, depended on a technological one, a desperate search for a machine that could count the hours with unwavering discipline. This monastic obsession with regimented time began to spill beyond the stone walls. The local peasant working his field by the sunrise and sunset heard the clear, authoritative bells marking periods of work and prayer. He lived in chaotic, nature-based time, but the monastery next door was demonstrating a new, powerful idea: that human order could be imposed upon the day. The steady rhythm of the cloister was a stark contrast to the unpredictable flow of the secular world, and that rhythm carried an undeniable authority. It was here, in this quiet collision of sacred regiment and secular chaos, that the seeds were planted for a battle over who would ultimately control the clock and, through it, the very pace of human life. That silhouette against the sky was far more than architecture. It was a declaration. As towns grew across medieval Europe, the race to build the highest, most imposing bell tower became a silent war of one-upmanship. Whoever owned the tower owned the sound, and whoever owned the sound dictated the rhythm of life for everyone below. Picture a peasant in the fields. He looks up and sees 3 distinct towers piercing the horizon. To one side, the sturdy square tower of the local feudal lord's castle. To the other, the elegant spire of the town's main church. And in the bustling market square, a new, robust tower built by the emerging merchant class and the city council. Each of these structures was a claim staked in the air itself, a physical argument about who truly held power. The Lord's bell might ring to summon laborers to his fields or to signal a curfew, a sound of feudal obligation. The church's bells called the faithful to Mass, marking time for the soul. But the new civic bell, that was different. It announced the opening of the market, the start and end of the artisan's workday, and even sounded an alarm in times of danger. This was time for commerce and community, a direct challenge to the old orders. The right to build a tower and to ring a bell was not given lightly. It was a privilege granted by kings or popes, a legal instrument that separated the powerful from the powerless. A town that could ring its own bell was a town with a degree of self-determination. It could organize its own defense, regulate its own economy, and literally set its own schedule. This is why the contest over these towers was so fierce. It was the first front in a silent battle, not for land or treasure, but for something far more pervasive: control over the very hours of the day. The sound of a bell could reach into every home, every workshop, and every field, bypassing walls and ignoring social status. This was the birth of public time, a shared rhythm that would eventually bind people together into a new kind of society. But first, it had to be seized from the hands of the old. The air in a thriving medieval city was thick with a battle of bells. From the soaring cathedral spire, the call to prayer marked the canonical hours, a rhythm for the soul. But from the new town hall tower, a different, more pragmatic chime rang out, announcing the opening of the market and the start of the paid workday. This was not just background noise, it was a sonic war for the city's very heartbeat. For centuries, the church's bells had been the only public timekeeper, their schedule oriented around prayer and spiritual reflection. But as trade boomed and a new class of wealthy merchants and artisans emerged, this celestial timetable became a hindrance to commerce. The city council needed to know precisely when the market stalls could open, when contracts were binding, and when the night watch began its patrol. So they invested in their own magnificent clock, housed in their own proud tower, and they rang their own bell. This was a direct, brazen challenge to the church's ancient authority. The right to mark time was the right to command a population, and now two powers were shouting different commands from on high. Imagine a cloth merchant, his livelihood dependent on the flow of goods and silver. Does he close his stall for Vespers when a ship full of wool has just arrived at the dock? Does he follow the sacred schedule or the civic one? His dilemma was a microcosm of a massive cultural shift. The town bell represented something revolutionary: time as a tool for civic independence and economic ambition. It was time transformed from a divine gift into a human resource, something to be managed, measured, and monetized. This clash over the schedule was a silent, daily referendum on who truly governed the city's life: the bishop in his cathedral or the mayor in his hall. And the outcome would echo in the very structure of our modern world. For the merchant standing in that bustling market, the town bell was the sound of money. Its chime did not call him to prayer or to feudal duty, it called him to opportunity. The chaotic, sun-dependent rhythms of the feudal estate were useless to a man whose wealth depended on shipments arriving from distant cities and contracts being honored at a precise moment. A deal struck for delivery at the ringing of the nun's bell was only as good as the trust that the bell would ring at the same time for both parties. This new, pressing need for reliable, public time created the merchant class's most powerful ally, the mechanical clock. Wealthy guilds and city councils poured vast sums into building and maintaining these complex machines, not as monuments to art or faith, but as investments in efficiency. The clock in the town square became the ultimate arbiter of business life. It standardized the workday for every artisan, from the weaver to the blacksmith, ensuring a fair measure of labor. It dictated the exact moment the market could open, preventing any one merchant from gaining an unfair advantage by starting early. And perhaps most importantly, it provided an impartial witness for legal and financial agreements. A promissory note could now be made due on a specific date and hour, enforceable by the city's authority. This was a revolution in contract law, all powered by the steady, predictable tick of a clock. For these ambitious merchants, time was no longer a cycle of seasons or a path to salvation. It was a raw material as valuable as silk or spice. It could be saved, wasted, or invested. By seizing control of the public clock from the church and the nobility, they were not just telling the time, they were building the very foundations of the modern economy, an order where profit and punctuality were forever intertwined. But while the towns built their towers of commerce, the countryside remained a fortress of a different kind of power. Far from the bustling market squares, life on a feudal manor was governed by a much older, more visceral rhythm. The Lord's bell was not a call to prayer or profit, but a command to labor. Its chime at sunrise meant every serf and tenant farmer was required to report to the Lord's fields. Its ring at dusk signaled the end of their obligated work. This was not public time, it was private time, owned and measured by the local aristocrat for his direct economic benefit. The entire agricultural cycle, from planting to harvest, was orchestrated by this sound, a constant reminder that the land, the people, and the very hours of their day belonged to him. The manorial bell was the ultimate tool of extraction, ensuring the Lord's demesne was worked before any peasant could tend to their own meager plot. It enforced the corvée, the system of unpaid labor that was the bedrock of the feudal economy. When news of the urban clocks reached these rural estates, the lords recognized the threat immediately. A town that could set its own time was a town that could defy tradition. In response, many aristocrats doubled down on their own authority, repairing old bell towers and enforcing their schedules with renewed vigor. This created a stark temporal divide. The city dweller lived by the impartial, measured tick of a mechanical clock, a rhythm of commerce and civic freedom. The peasant, however, remained subject to the arbitrary ring of the manorial bell, a rhythm of obligation and subjugation. The choice between these two sounds was a choice between two worlds, one looking forward to a future of contracts and wages, the other bound to a past of service and duty. This was the silent battle made audible, a conflict over who had the right to wake you up and send you to bed. Deep within the stone heart of the town hall tower, a complex machine redefined reality. The early public clock was a symphony of iron and brass, a heavy weight slowly descending on a rope, its fall harnessed by a series of interlocking gears. This entire system was governed by its most crucial component, the verge and foliot escapement. This ingenious device was the clock's soul, a rocking mechanism that allowed the gear train to move forward in tiny, regulated ticks instead of spinning out of control. The foliot was a horizontal bar with adjustable weights, and by sliding these weights inward or outward, the clockkeeper could literally change the speed of time itself. Sliding the weights out made the bar rock more slowly, delaying each tick and making the clock run late. Pushing them in closer to the center created a faster, more frantic rhythm, speeding the hours ahead. This was not just a machine for measuring time, it was a machine for manufacturing it. The person entrusted with this delicate task, often a skilled blacksmith or locksmith, held an authority that was almost magical. He decided when the town officially woke, worked, and rested. A clock running just a few minutes fast each day could, over a week, steal precious moments of sleep from the populace or cut short their evening meals. A clock running slow could make workers late for their shifts, costing them wages and earning the displeasure of the merchant guilds. This subtle manipulation was a form of power that required no soldiers and issued no decrees. It simply altered the shared reality of an entire community. The clockkeeper answered to the city council, and through this control over the mechanism, the council could discreetly enforce its will, favoring commerce over prayer or extending a market day to boost tax revenue. The true power in the city was not always in the mayor's chair, but in the shadowy chamber where one man's hands calibrated the pace of thousands of lives. That power to manufacture time was not left to chance, it was etched into law. Across Europe, town councils began drafting statutes that transformed the bell's chime from a public service into a legally binding command. In one 14th century Italian city, a parchment decree explicitly mandated that all wool workers must begin their labor at the first ring of the market bell and were not permitted to leave their looms until the bell signaled the end of the workday. To ignore this call was no longer a simple act of laziness, it was a punishable offense against the city itself. These ordinances codified clock time, weaving the new mechanical rhythm directly into the fabric of civic life and enforceable order. A craftsman arriving late could be fined. A merchant who closed his stall early might face sanctions from his guild. The law became the enforcer, ensuring that the entire economic machine moved in lockstep with the town clock's unchanging beat. This was the ultimate weaponization of punctuality. It turned temporal compliance into a civic duty, a new form of social control that was far more subtle and pervasive than the brute force of a feudal lord. Where the noble's authority was personal and arbitrary, the clock's law was impersonal and absolute. It did not matter who you were, the bell tolled for everyone equally, and the statutes guaranteed that everyone obeyed. This legal framework made the abstract concept of time into something concrete, something that could be regulated, disputed in court, and used to manage an entire population's productivity. The battle for the bells was now over, and the victors had not only captured the tower, they had written their victory into the law books, ensuring that every tick of the clock reinforced their power. This constant auditory command carved new pathways in the human mind. The bell did not merely tell people what to do, it taught them when to think about doing it. Over years and generations, the chime ceased to be an external signal and became an internal trigger, a psychological switch that flipped automatically. A worker deep in a private thought would hear the bell for the end of the workday, and his body would relax before his mind had even fully processed the sound. His muscles and mood had been conditioned by the relentless, predictable rhythm. This was a profound shift from living by need, by the rising sun or a growling stomach, to living by schedule. The natural, flowing time of the body was being systematically replaced by the artificial, segmented time of the clock. This new time discipline cultivated a novel and relentless sense of urgency. Where a farmer might have judged a task by how much daylight remained, a city artisan now measured it by how many ticks of the clock he had been allotted. Efficiency was no longer just a practical goal, it was a mental state, a constant pressure to fit more action into each identical, measured hour. This mental reprogramming was the silent battle's ultimate victory. It was not enough for the authorities to control the tower, they needed to control the internal rhythm of every person living in its shadow. The most powerful weapon was not the bell itself, but the obedient anticipation it created in the minds of the populace. They learned to police their own time, to feel a pang of guilt for a moment of idleness, to hurry when the bell commanded haste. This internal clock, synchronized to the one in the town square, is a legacy that still ticks within us today. The rebellion did not begin with a call to arms, but with a refusal to answer a call to work. In the summer of 1381, a massive army of English peasants and artisans marched on London, seizing the capital and confronting the young King Richard II. Their list of grievances was long, targeting poll taxes and corrupt officials, but woven through their demands was a quieter, more profound complaint, a fury against the manorial bell. For generations, the Lord's timepiece had dictated their labor, but the increasing precision of its measurement felt like a new form of theft. The workday, once loosely defined by the sun's arc, was now being passed into meticulously monitored hours, each one a unit of life extracted for another's profit. This was not an abstract philosophical dispute. It was a raw conflict over the value of a human life measured in minutes. The peasants understood that the clock was not a neutral tool. It was the sharpest instrument in the Lord's box, used to carve more labor from their days without granting them a single extra coin. Their revolt was a direct response to this temporal oppression, a violent rejection of the idea that a bell could own their waking hours. When they stormed the manors, they did not just burn tax records, they sought out and destroyed the very symbols of this control. The smashing of a water clock or the silencing of a bell tower was a revolutionary act, a declaration that the people, not the Lord, should command the rhythm of their own lives. This uprising demonstrated with terrifying clarity that the weaponization of time had real and explosive consequences. The silent battle was silent no more. It had erupted into the streets, proving that when the control of the clock becomes too oppressive, the controlled will eventually rise to smash it. The sound of a bell was not just a signal, it was a border. A city's entire social and political structure was mapped not in stone, but in sound, an invisible acoustic territory that everyone understood and obeyed. The loudest, deepest peal always came from the primary seat of power, whether it was the cathedral or the town hall. This sound was engineered for dominance, cast from the largest bronze and swung by the heaviest clapper to ensure it traveled the farthest, drowning out all other noises and reaching into the most distant suburbs. This was not an accident of acoustics, it was a calculated assertion of authority. Then came the answering chimes from rival institutions, slightly softer and less frequent, each one carving out its own auditory domain. The monastery on the hill might ring for prayers, its tone distinct from the merchant's guild announcing a market. These sounds created a hierarchy of the airwaves, a constant, unspoken negotiation of influence that played out every hour. And then there were the silences, the spaces where no bell was permitted to ring, the homes of the poor, the workshops of the lowliest artisans, the entire districts that were acoustically subordinate. To be without a bell was to be without a public voice, to be a listener and never a caller. This sonic landscape taught every citizen their place in the social order before they ever saw a noble or a priest. You knew who ruled your life not by a document, but by the sound that reached your doorstep most clearly and most often. The control of this soundscape was a form of governance as real as any tax or law, a constant reminder that power was not just something you saw, but something you heard. The predictable chime of authority was sometimes met with the quiet tear of fabric. Under the cover of a moonless night, figures would scale the creaking ladders of a bell tower, not to ring the bell but to silence it. Their weapon of choice was often a simple bundle of straw, stuffed tightly into the bronze mouth of the instrument. This silent sabotage was a brilliant act of rebellion, a way to disarm the powerful without a single telltale crash. For one precious morning, the Lord would not be able to summon his laborers, or the town council would fail to start the workday. The resulting confusion was a small but potent victory, a temporary return to the older, more fluid time that belonged to the people, not to their masters. This was temporal disobedience, a direct refusal to participate in a system of control everyone understood all too well. When such subtle methods were not enough, the frustration could boil over into something far more destructive. During riots and popular uprisings, the clock tower was often a primary target. Mobs armed with hammers and crowbars would storm the town hall, seeking out the intricate clockwork that governed their lives. They did not see a marvel of engineering, they saw the heart of their oppression, a machine of whirring gears that measured out their lives in units of exploited labor. Smashing its delicate escapement and shattering its face was an act of profound symbolic power. It was an attempt to kill the artificial tyrant, to shatter the very mechanism that enforced the schedule of their subjugation. Each blow of the hammer was a declaration that they would no longer let a machine dictate the value of their hours. These acts of sabotage, from the silent stuffing of a bell to the public demolition of a clock, were never just about property damage. They were clear, deliberate attacks on the symbols of a new and oppressive power. The people who carried them out were not vandals, they were revolutionaries of the schedule, fighting to reclaim a fundamental human right, the autonomy over their own time. The plague's silence was more terrifying than any bell. In village after village, the familiar rhythms of life simply stopped. The bell ringer was dead. The priest who called for prayer was gone. The lord who demanded labor had fled or perished in his manor. The auditory landscape of control fell into an eerie, unnerving quiet. The very structure of the day, that rigid framework of obligation and order, dissolved into a grim struggle for survival. This was the Black Death's hidden legacy, a catastrophic breakdown of the established temporal order. With up to half the population wiped out, a profound power vacuum opened up, and the weapon of timekeeping was suddenly lying silent in the dust. The surviving laborers, now a scarce and precious commodity, found themselves with unprecedented leverage. A peasant who once had to obey the manorial bell or face starvation now had multiple lords competing for his services. He could demand higher wages, refuse to work from sunup to sundown, and reject the old, grinding schedule. The feudal system, built on the extraction of time through the sound of a bell, was shattered not by rebellion but by pestilence. The value of a human hour was suddenly renegotiated in real time. A day's labor was now worth 3 times what it was before the plague, because a day of life was so much more fragile and rare. This crisis demonstrated a terrifying truth to the ruling classes. Their control was not inherent, it was dependent on a predictable and plentiful supply of human time. When that supply was devastated, their entire system of temporal discipline collapsed. The silent bells of the plague years were a stark lesson in the true source of power. It was not the tower or the bronze, but the living, breathing people whose daily rhythms gave the chime its meaning. And when those people were gone, the schedule they had been forced to follow became nothing more than a forgotten echo. The authority of the monastery bell began to fade like a distant echo. For centuries, its call had structured life across Europe, but by the late Middle Ages, the economic foundations that supported the great monastic houses were crumbling. Their vast landholdings, once worked by devout lay brothers and pious tenants, became difficult to manage. The very piety that had filled their coffers with donations from nobles was now directed elsewhere, toward new urban charities and the rising universities. The monks, once the undisputed masters of the hour, found their political and financial power waning. As their influence receded, so too did the pervasive sound of their celestial schedule. The rhythm of prayer, which had once competed with the needs of the manor and the market, now sounded more and more like a relic from a passing age. This created a vacuum of authority, a silence in the daily order that was quickly filled by a new, more pragmatic sound. The baton of temporal power was not dropped, it was seized. Town councils, merchant guilds, and ambitious city fathers stepped confidently into the role of timekeeper. They understood that controlling the clock was essential for governing a complex commercial society. Their bells did not mark the canonical hours for prayer, but the market hours for trade, the work hours for artisans, and the watch hours for civic security. This was the final, decisive secularization of time. It was no longer a divine measure, a path to salvation laid out in 7 daily segments. It became a tool, a resource to be managed with the same meticulous care as a city's treasury or its grain supply. The transformation was now complete. Time had been unhooked from the heavens and bolted firmly to the earth. becoming the fundamental instrument of civic order and commercial ambition that still dictates the pace of our lives today. Inside the guild hall, the bell was the sound of brotherhood. Its chime did far more than start the workday. It orchestrated the entire life of the craft, from a boy's first lesson to a master's final honor. When the bell rang at dawn, every apprentice and journeyman knew to be at their bench, their tools ready. The same bell would later call them to a shared meal, to a meeting to settle disputes, or to a solemn procession through the city streets. This shared rhythm forged a powerful collective identity, binding shoemakers to shoemakers and weavers to weavers in a tight-knit fraternity. The guild's control over time was the bedrock of its economic power. A complex apprenticeship system lasting 7 years or more was meticulously regulated by this sound. An apprentice's progress was measured not in years, but in thousands of hours of supervised labor, each one marked by the guild's own bell. This ensured that every craftsman met an exacting standard before he could ever open his own shop. The bell also enforced the guild's most precious asset, its monopoly. By dictating a standardized workday for all members, it prevented any one master from undercutting his brothers by working longer hours to produce more goods. Quality was tied directly to time, a belief that rushing a piece of leather or a length of cloth would lead to shoddy work that shamed the entire guild. The bell, therefore, was the guardian of both their reputation and their price. In a world of growing competition, the guild used this temporal discipline to protect its members, ensuring that no individual's ambition could disrupt the fragile harmony of the whole. For these men, time was not money in a purely individual sense. It was the mortar that held their entire world together. The hourglass brought timekeeping down from the tower and into the hands of individuals. This was not the slow, grinding tick of a public clock, but the silent, relentless pour of sand through a narrow glass waist. Its genius lay in its simplicity and portability. A captain on the deck of a ship far from any town could measure the half-hour watches of his crew. A university professor could time his lectures to the last grain of sand. A court of law could use it to ensure that both sides in a dispute had an equal, measured moment to speak. This small device was a revolution in miniature, decentralizing the power to measure time away from the single, authoritative tower and distributing it across countless institutions and individuals. Suddenly, the monopoly of the great public clock was broken. A merchant could time a business meeting in his own home. A ship's captain could impose a strict schedule on his crew in the middle of the trackless ocean, creating a floating island of disciplined time. This was a profound shift. It meant that the authority to segment and control time was no longer the exclusive right of the church or the city council. The hourglass empowered smaller, more specific forms of power to create their own temporal realities. The silent battle over timekeeping was no longer just a conflict between cathedral bells and town bells. It was now a fragmented war fought on 1,000 small fronts, in courtrooms, classrooms, and on the high seas, wherever someone could turn a glass and command, "Your time starts now." These astronomical clocks were far more than public timepieces. They were entire universes captured in spinning brass and gilded paint, engineered to display the sun and moon's path, the current zodiac sign, and the dance of known planets across a fixed celestial sphere. Anyone gazing up at this mechanical marvel saw a vision of cosmic order, a perfect, predictable machine designed by God. And by building it, the cathedral or city council was making an extraordinary claim. They were not just telling you the hour, they were demonstrating that they understood the very laws that governed the heavens. This was the ultimate act of legitimization. If an institution could replicate the clockwork of the cosmos here on Earth, then surely its earthly authority was also part of that grand, divine design. The clock's beauty was a weapon, dazzling the populace into a state of awe and submission. It said, "Our power is not merely political, it is cosmological. We do not just rule you, we interpret the universe for you." The message to a common citizen was unmistakable. Just as the moon follows its set path and Saturn moves through its prescribed cycle, so too should you follow the social order we preside over. Your place in the world, like a star's place in the firmament, is fixed and natural. These clocks transformed abstract astronomical knowledge into a powerful, silent sermon that played out every hour, reinforcing the idea that challenging the authorities was as futile as challenging the orbit of the sun itself. A worker's life was once measured by tasks completed, not hours spent. The peasant farmer finished when the field was plowed, the housewife when the bread was baked. This was task-oriented time, a rhythm dictated by the needs of survival and the limits of daylight. But the relentless chime of the public clock shattered that ancient rhythm forever. It introduced a radical new concept that labor itself could be quantified not by what was produced, but by the sheer number of hours a person spent producing it. The clock enabled the precise calculation of a workday, a measurable block of time that could be assigned a fixed monetary value. This was the birth of the wage, a payment not for a finished pair of shoes or a harvested bushel of wheat, but for the abstract commodity of time itself. A master craftsman no longer paid his apprentice in room and board for learning a trade. He paid a journeyman by the hour for the use of his hands. This shift was monumental. Time was suddenly stripped from its natural context and transformed into a thing that could be bought, sold, saved, and most ominously wasted. The relationship between worker and employer was fundamentally rewritten. The employer now purchased slices of a person's life, and the worker sold them. Your time was no longer your own, it was an asset to be traded for survival. This new economic logic turned every moment of idleness into a potential loss, and every tick of the clock into a reminder of earnings forfeited. The foundation of modern capitalism was being laid not in a banker's ledger, but in the public square, with every ring of the bell that started and ended the paid workday. How much of your own life feels like a commodity to be scheduled and sold? Even the most rigid clockwork schedule could be shattered by the sound of a different kind of bell. Throughout the medieval year, a cascade of religious festivals and holidays created pockets of what felt like timelessness, official periods when the demands of the clock were officially suspended. This was festival time, a cyclical rhythm of feasts, processions, and communal revelry that stood in direct opposition to the linear, productive march of the civic clock. For a few glorious days, the relentless pressure to work and earn vanished, replaced by a sanctioned space for celebration, leisure, and social inversion. A peasant who bowed his head all year might, in a festival play, mock his lord with impunity. The normal hierarchy was temporarily turned upside down, and the town bell, which usually commanded labor, now called everyone to a party. This created a deep, perennial tension. The very authorities who built the clocks to enforce order found their own system being regularly undermined by the ancient, powerful rhythm of the church's calendar. They saw these popular festivals as a direct threat to public order and economic productivity. A 3-day feast for a local saint meant 3 days of lost labor in the fields and workshops, 3 days of tax revenue gone, and 3 days where the populace, drunk on ale and freedom, might forget their proper place. Town councils and moral reformers repeatedly tried to suppress the wilder elements of these celebrations, issuing decrees against excessive drinking, rowdy street plays, and the wearing of disguises. Their goal was to tame festival time, to make it more orderly, shorter, and less disruptive to the business of the city. But the people clung fiercely to these breaks in the routine. The battle was not just over a day off, but over the very nature of time itself. Was time a resource to be spent, or was it a cycle to be experienced? Was the purpose of life to produce goods or to celebrate community and faith? This conflict played out in the calendar itself, a silent war between the ticking of the clock and the ringing of the festival bell. The printed word carried a new kind of authority, one that could travel silently and instantly across vast distances. With the invention of the printing press, the battle over time was no longer confined to the soundscape of a single city. It could be fought on paper and distributed by the thousands. A town council no longer had to rely solely on its bell to command the populace. It could now nail a printed broadsheet to the church door, detailing a new, standardized market schedule that every merchant was expected to follow. This sheet of paper, identical to hundreds of others posted across the region, created a unified rhythm that transcended local bells. For the first time, a farmer bringing his goods to market from a distant village could know with certainty the exact hour the trading would begin because he had read the same schedule as everyone else. This was a revolution in coordination, dissolving the old patchwork of local times into a seamless, regional tempo. The printed almanac became perhaps the most powerful timekeeping tool in the common person's home. More than just a farmer's guide to planting and weather, these books contained detailed calendars, tide tables, and charts for the movements of the sun and moon. They allowed a ship's captain in Bristol and a merchant in London to plan a voyage using the same astronomical data, synchronizing their activities months in advance. This printed knowledge created a shared temporal framework that was national in scope, steadily eroding the idiosyncratic rhythms of individual manors and towns. The local lord's bell, which had once dictated a unique schedule for his estate, now seemed parochial and outdated next to the precise, printed timetables that connected the entire kingdom. The press did not just spread information, it manufactured a new kind of time consciousness, one that was uniform, predictable, and centrally managed. The silent battle had found its most potent weapon yet, not in bronze or stone, but in ink and paper, a force that would ultimately synchronize the actions of millions into the relentless, ticking beat of the modern world. Darkness brought a different kind of authority to the medieval city. As the sun vanished, the final bell of the evening was not a call to prayer or to work, but a command to extinguish all fires and retreat indoors. This was the curfew, a word derived from the French for cover fire, and its ringing sound was the law. The bell signaled a city-wide lockdown, a temporal wall that separated the lawful day from the perilous night. Its purpose was twofold: to prevent catastrophic fires that could leap from thatched roof to thatched roof in a single spark, and to impose a rigid social order when the sun could no longer act as a watchman. Once that bell tolled, the streets were meant to be empty. The only legitimate souls abroad were the members of the Night Watch, men drawn from the citizenry and operating on a strict, bell-driven schedule of their own. Their patrols were the physical extension of the curfew's sound, a human enforcement of the temporal boundary. They challenged any shadowy figure they encountered, demanding to know their business. A traveler without a valid reason, a reveler stumbling home too late, or a group gathering in secret, all represented a breach of this nocturnal order. The night was a time of fear, but also of potential. It was when conspiracies could be hatched in tavern cellars, when illicit goods could be moved through back alleys, and when the discontented could plot against the city fathers. The curfew and its watch were not just about stopping burglaries, they were a preemptive strike against the clandestine activities that threatened to unravel the carefully controlled daytime society. By weaponizing the night schedule, the authorities extended their reach into the hours when their visual symbols of power, the towers and banners, were invisible. They proved that their control was not limited by the sun, it was as perpetual as the turning of the clock. we can still read the very laws that weaponized the bell. Tucked away in the city archives of Siena, a parchment from 1347 details the exact penalty for any wool weaver caught working before the morning bell. The fine was steep, a clear message that no individual could defy the collective schedule. This was not a suggestion, it was a legally enforced rhythm. Similar records from London list the specific payments made to the official clockkeeper, a man whose salary depended on his unwavering maintenance of the town's temporal order. These are not dry historical footnotes, they are the battle plans for the silent war over time. The statutes go beyond mere regulation. They reveal a conscious, almost obsessive effort to engineer society through sound. A civic record from 14th century Ghent meticulously outlines the entire sonic landscape of the day. It decrees that the great bell of the cloth hall shall ring first to wake all workers, then a second time to signal the moment they must be at their looms. Another chime marks the midday meal, and a final, solemn toll ends the workday, after which no weaving could legally continue. Every hour was accounted for, every transition commanded. These documents offer a startlingly clear window into the minds of the medieval administrators. They show us that the structuring of public time was a deliberate act of policy, as carefully considered as the levying of a tax or the building of a city wall. The men who wrote these schedules understood that to control the clock was to control the human activity that filled it, directing the flow of commerce, devotion, and labor with the simple, undeniable authority of a ringing bell. Every bell carried a permanent, silent speech cast in bronze. Along the curving waist of a great town bell, you would often find an inscription in Latin, phrases like "I call the living," "I mourn the dead," "I break the lightning." This was more than poetry. It was a declaration of the bell's divine-like powers over the community. But the most telling words were the names. A bell that proudly displayed the name of the ruling bishop or a wealthy abbot was a direct assertion of ownership. It said, "This sound and the time it marks belongs to the church." Yet as you move into the 14th and 15th centuries, a shift occurs. You start to see bells inscribed with the names of the city mayor, the merchant guilds, or the entire citizen body. One famous bell in Ghent was cast with the phrase, "I am called Roland. My voice is the law in all the land." Roland was not a saint. He was the name of the city's iconic bell, a clear symbol of civic justice triumphing over ecclesiastical rule. This was a visual coup, a permanent claim staked not in a document that could burn, but in the very metal that rang out each day. The sound might fade into the air, but the inscription remained, a durable testament to who truly held the authority to command the hours. How often do we stop to read the silent messages embedded in the tools that govern our own lives? The while European towns fought their sonic wars, a different temporal order was unfolding under the domes and minarets of the East. The Islamic world developed a relationship with time that was deeply unified, centered on the 5 daily calls to prayer. This sacred rhythm, announced from the mosque's minaret, synchronized an entire civilization from Spain to India, orienting daily life not around commerce or civic duty, but around devotion. To support this, Muslim engineers created marvels of hydraulic engineering, intricate water clocks that not only tracked the hours but also performed automated spectacles, with moving figures and chiming bells that delighted and informed the public. In Constantinople, the Byzantine Empire maintained the timekeeping traditions of Rome, its complex water clocks and sundials serving as symbols of imperial continuity and divine favor for the emperor. Yet in both these great civilizations, time was largely a unified field. The call to prayer and the imperial clock did not face a loud, persistent challenger from a rising merchant class. There was no equivalent to the European town hall, with its own bell defiantly ringing out a competing schedule for profit. This is what made the European experience so uniquely combustible. Time became a battleground precisely because power was so fragmented. When the bishop's bell, the lord's bell, and the merchant's bell all clashed in the same city square, it forced a constant public debate over the very purpose of time itself. Was it for God, for the feudal lord, or for the market? This relentless competition, this daily sonic civil war, is what ultimately transformed the clock from a tool of order into a relentless engine of social and economic change. That persistent ping from your smartphone is the modern echo of the medieval town bell. Both sounds represent a fundamental and enduring conflict, a silent battle over who has the right to command your attention and schedule your hours. The feudal lord's demand for labor has been replaced by the corporate demand for productivity, the church's call to prayer by the app's notification for a new email. The arena has simply shifted from the public square to the palm of your hand. Consider the productivity software that meticulously tracks every minute of your workday, quantifying your focus into data points for managerial review. This is the direct heir of the Chinese statute that fined a weaver for working outside the sanctioned hours. Both systems are designed to extract maximum value from measured time, enforcing a rhythm that serves an institution's goals. The modern gig economy, where your income is directly tied to slices of an hour, perfectly mirrors the medieval shift from task-based labor to clock-based wages. You are still selling parcels of your life, only now the transaction is digital and the boss is an algorithm. And what is the constant, curated feed of social media, if not a new form of festival time? It is a sanctioned space of distraction engineered to capture your focus, pulling you away from your own priorities and into a cycle of consumption that profits a different kind of authority. The battle is no longer over whose bell rings loudest from a stone tower, but over whose app earns the privilege to send you a push notification. This is not a new war, it is the same ancient conflict fought with new weapons. Our struggle for digital wellness and the right to disconnect is the modern equivalent of peasants stuffing straw into a bell to silence its command. The deep human desire for autonomy over our time, to live by our own rhythms rather than an imposed schedule, has remained constant for centuries. The chime has just changed its shape. That echo has never truly faded. It has simply changed its form, moving from the bronze bell in the town square to the sleek screen in your pocket. The silent battle over who controls our time is the enduring legacy of the medieval tower, a conflict that continues to shape our lives in profound and often invisible ways. From the quiet monasteries to the bustling metropolis, timekeeping was never a neutral act of measurement. It was a weapon meticulously forged in the fires of political ambition, economic greed, and the relentless human drive for social control. The struggle between the bishop, the lord, and the merchant to own the public schedule created the very world we inhabit, a world governed by the clock. Understanding this history gives us a powerful new lens. It allows us to see our own daily grind not as a natural fact of life, but as the latest chapter in an ancient power struggle. When you feel the pressure of a deadline, the guilt of unproductive moments, or the constant pull of notifications, you are experiencing the modern incarnation of that medieval bell. It is a sound that has been internalized, a rhythm that now ticks within us. The battle is no longer about whose bell rings loudest from a stone tower, but whose app has the privilege to command your next moment. So as you navigate your own schedule, caught between work and life, between productivity and peace, take a moment to reflect. How much of your time feels truly your own? How do you manage your hours within this vast historical legacy of control? The fight for autonomy over our attention and our days is the same fight that has been waged for centuries. We would love to hear your thoughts on this enduring power struggle in the comments below.